Some people are condemned to live a life of perpetual adolescence. Most people seem to be able to age in what's considered the normal way for their time and place, and some are unlucky enough to acquire some degree of understanding of life younger than most. Such was the case of Mason Towell, who, at the age of 23, had realised that the whole experience was a joke, just not the kind of joke you'd actually tell because you'd know it would fall flat in its arse and you'd be stared at and judged very wanting in terms of social skills and possibly intelligence. It was merely a combination of the right experience and simply being able to work it out at the right time. Perhaps it was also that youthful enthusiasm and naivety about the big questions were skills he could never acquire. But ultimately he realised that the whole thing was a shit show. For some, of course, a whirling void of constantly choking imposition and resulting pain, confusion and fear. For others, a blissful ignorance that would stand them in good enough stead to last them until they perished. For a few, a good gig. More pretended that they were of that few than the few themselves, who often didn't have to advertise their pleasure at existing and enjoying all the benefits that existence could afford on those fortunate enough to both gain and enjoy them. Mason often found inspiration for his realisation from those pretences, the constant insistence that these people were living their best lives, with constant visual documented proof for those ridiculous assertions. He found it wasn't a difficult thing at all to see through that crap. He found it was a difficult thing, more and more, to tolerate it. Not to mention everything else he was expected to tolerate. The usual pressures and insistences of society and its worthless culture. Education, qualifications, career, lover, family, mortgage, pet, social circle, football team, personal interests, holidays, kids' education, kids' qualifications, kids' career, ad nauseam ad infinitum, the whole seemingly endless stretch of the same old shit that, much to Mason's never dulled astonishment, he wasn't entirely burnt out, a great many people he knew, from family to friends to acquaintances to random strangers, seemed to be wholly at one and in accord with. If it wasn't the constant stream of miseries, both minor and major, that always accompanied this venture, everything from having to get up in the morning to the unspoken perils of sickness, animosities, accidents, boredom, and long-standing anxiety and depression, that would convince people of the futility of it all, why not even the futility of it all itself? To point at the stupidity and suffering of our existence and declare it not only quite painful but actually very pointless seemed a feat simple enough to Mason, but outside of the reach of even the most intelligent people he knew. He could not, for the life of him, understand it. So he gave up trying, and it was in that he achieved the ultimate maturity. Shrill, attention-seeking exceptions aside, most people reach an age where they know instinctively that it isn't worth the bother to keep trying, and they settle themselves into whatever good enough they may happen to be in. The huge numbers of people who find mirth surviving itself a constant cruel struggle accepted, of course. Mason, luckily for him, was not in those numbers. He had just worked it all out and had given up on it, which infuriated his parents, siblings, most friends and anyone else he knew no end. Being on government social security and spending his days staring at his mobile phone was not the kind of life his mother and father had envisioned for him, as some parents are wont to do. Well, not consider those parents whose ambition for their offspring ranged between blatant manipulation to outright indifference. But he had acquired an immunity to their nagging or pleading or friendly advice-giving or whatever other excuses they had on hand to serve up. He remained, for the most part, on his back in his bed in his bedroom, staring at his phone, and feeling remarkably free from guilt about it. The only real bane of his life was his requirement to show an account to the government department that paid him his meagre stipend of a pretend eagerness to find a job. No one throughout the entire system had any expectation of him and a huge number of others on their books to actually find a job good enough to keep for life. Everybody knew it was an immense pantomime whose sole objective was to tick the right boxes in reports with which the government of the day could show some kind of account to anybody who was bored enough to look for it. No one cared, not really. Everyone knew it was all about appearances. The only real emotions that existed in the offices of this layer of state bureaucracy were boredom and resentment and the occasional pangs of forgetting their work as they engaged in banter and other conversations. But the situation was well understood by all, with, again, the exception of those who were rather attached to their delusions of personal grandeur, expressed in either calculated sadism towards the victims always referred to as clients, or, just as bad, the over-eager types who felt they really wanted to help people, two sides of the same rancid coin that should never have been minted. And so Mason was required to once a fortnight front up to his local office to report for duty. It was much the same as working, as he thought of it, and in fact it was. He had to present well, had to have a written account of his job hunting activities, had to engage with an excruciating discussion with his case manager, who seemed to change every 6 months, and any other motion needed to go through before he could walk out with great relief and feel he had endured in a few measly minutes an entire day's worth of objectionable activity. It was at such an occasion that the case manager in this case gave him the news that he had been dreading, but still fell on him like a bolt from the black. "Oh, here's something. An office looking for staff and they'll train. You'll be up for that, won't you?" As if he could say no, as if he could do nothing but sit there in near astonishment and merely, weakly affirm. "Good, I'll just set up an interview for you then." An interview. He hadn't been to a proper job interview in ages, but had heard a lot about how the experience had become something of a gauntlet of cheerful posturing and affecting a kind of semi-enthusiastic pose that mitigated any actual honesty. He wasn't sure how he would react to a question like, "Why do you want to work with us?" without saying he didn't. Not to mention the fact that these days apparently you'd be interviewed by more than one person and might have to endure more than one interview. Things had become increasingly more insane as the years ground on. Nothing was simple or easy, and the trajectory seemed to be increasingly difficult. But more than that, increasingly unnecessarily difficult. Every new hurdle just seemed more pointless than the last, and to make matters worse, you were expected, without being straight up told to, of course, to be cheerful about it all, as if all this interminable bullshit was par for your own daily course like everyone else's. Maybe that's what was going on. Things were getting stupider so people could give off the impression of being perfectly at ease in any situation, no matter how stupid, which couldn't be more stupid, which only made the usual business of the job interview worse than it already was. To have to dress up like a dick, find one's way to the place of business, endure the waiting time in a room with other hopefuls you're competing with, appearing calm and friendly when really you feel like the complete opposite of both. All these things were trials in themselves without all the extra bullshit that no one needed or asked for in the first place. Civilised humanity was going mad, Mason had decided. Not a very original observation, he realised, but it didn't matter. What really worried him was whether he was going just as mad along with everyone else. He found himself, the next day, in one of those horrible avenues of industrial buildings that make one think of the imaginary concept of the soul, on account of imagining it being sucked out of everyone's body by the very miserable architecture and aspects of the buildings alone. Everything was sheer utility, but a utility to no obvious purpose, and certainly no real desired end. Just utility for its own sake, without any style or grace or objective. The architectural equivalence of the polo shirt or the high-vis waistcoat. One of those buildings was indeed an office block, and the entrance was a bit more obvious than access to other buildings. He saw few people walking around. This was a place for cars only. Getting in and out quickly made sense in an area that forbade any contemplative walking around. He managed to park near enough to the building and went up a few stairs, through the inevitable glass door and into the foyer with its inevitable relaxed-looking front desk, modern minimalist furniture and painting on the wall, in this case a token Aboriginal dot daubing to show off the company's inevitable commitment to inclusivity. And the inevitable young attractive woman serving at the front desk was not lacking either, though, inevitably, she was on the phone. That didn't bother Mason. He just stood patiently in his cheap shirt and tie combination, his resume and other stupid bits of paper in a folder. The young attractive woman nodded and smiled to recognise him and lifted a hand in a "be right with you" gesture. He was content to wait out the call. Once finished, the young attractive woman smiled brightly as if pleased to meet him. Azathoth only knew what her real thoughts were, and inquired if she could help him. He informed her his name and that he was here for an interview. "Oh, good," she said brightly, which did in fact take Mason aback somewhat. He was expecting more to be asked to wait while she made inquiries. Instead, she promptly picked up the phone and put herself through to someone. "Beck, it's Mason Towell here. Okay, fine." She put the phone down and told Mason that Beck would be right down. And in the next moment, there she was, another youngish woman, veering more into middle age, dressed in the traditional corporate get-up. "Mason? Hi, Beck Cartwell, assistant manager. Thanks for coming in. You find the place okay?" "Yeah, it wasn't hard at all." Good. Well, just come with me. We're just upstairs." And she whirled around to head to the elevators. Mason thanked the young attractive woman at the front desk and followed Beck Cartwook, assistant manager, to the lifts. One was promptly opened for them. In the lift, Cartwook made some small talk about traffic and weather and the upcoming grand final, to which Mason replied with all due politeness and deference, despite having no shit to give about either of those phenomena. But they were on the third floor in due course, and Mason followed Cartwalk into a hall on either side of which were a number of doors to offices. He had been expecting more of the open plan type of arrangement, which he was also dreading. Everyone on display to everyone else as if that improved anything, with the exception of offices reserved for management and other sinister Kabbalists. "This one is yours, number 14, Beck announced, and flung open the door to a small office which had the stark furnishings of a desk with chair, computer and rubbish bin. The window took up the whole wall facing outside, but the view was nothing to consider. For a moment Mason had nothing to say. "Sorry, mine, I'm here for an interview." Beck nodded. "That's okay, we'll dispense with all that. We don't need it, really." She pointed to a few pieces of A4 paper on the desk. "That'll give you the passwords you need. If you need any more help, just press 01 and you'll get maintenance. They're pretty good." Mason could only stare in response. "So, you start 9 tomorrow, is that okay?" He could barely know where to look, let alone what to think. "Sorry, you're saying I've got a job here already?" "Yep. We don't muck around recruiting here. You'll be fine, don't worry. Any help you need, call maintenance, and I'm in the second office from the lift, so you can always come to me for help. Seems to be all I do around here," she added with a kind of laugh. "So the hours are 9 to 5, you've got lunch at 12. It's meant to be half an hour, but don't worry if it's a bit over. You clock in when you enter the intranet." "Don't I have to sign anything?" "Oh, you can do that tomorrow when you come in. It'll be online, just follow the prompts. Bring in your bank account details, whatever other information you think we'll need to know." "Okay, but this is all a bit quick, really." "Yeah, look, everyone feels that way at first. No one will be pushing you, though. All the training you'll need is online. It'll all count to your work hours, so you'll be paid, don't worry. We'll need your super details too, if you have it. But if there's anything else, that's okay. We'll have you set up in a few days." "Do I need an ID card?" "Oh, no, you're right. Just show up." No ID card. That didn't make a lot of sense. Mason was starting to feel this was something of a fly-by-night company that just scarfed people up, used them and then disappeared when the scam was discovered. "If you want to log in now, maybe give us some details. That'll be fine too. There'll be no passes or anything on the door. The staff room is just down the other end of the hall," she gestured, "and there's plenty of tea, coffee, biscuits, all of that, so..." She sighed and slapped her hands on her sides as if having reached a conclusion. "You go ahead and log in, get your details in, then look around all you want. Talk to people, you know. I'll just be down the hall, like I said. I've got to get on with my own things. Sorry for being rushed, but look, like I said, there's no rushing you. Take all the time you want. All the login details are there." And she took her leave. Mason looked around. The office space was small, as such spaces went, but it wasn't a cupboard. There was no decoration to be seen, apart from some standard framed picture of some semi-abstract sailboat or something. His first thought was to contact his job provider with his suspicions. He didn't feel like just giving his personal details to a company whose business he didn't even know. What exactly do they do here? The company's name, Monopile, meant nothing. He had looked them up and found the usual corporate website with all the smiling faces and platitudes about integrity and commitment and inclusivity and winky-wanky woo, but nothing at all to describe exactly what they produced in terms of services or products. He found nothing online to tell him that they were dodgy, so the impression was they weren't, but nothing to tell him what they actually were. He decided to at least have a look at their intranet structure, and he found himself surprised again at how easy it was to access it. He put in the temporary passwords made available, and there it was. There was an introduction page asking him which section he wanted to go to. None of them, of course, but he checked the manuscript he'd been left with and was directed to go to Data Input. He did so and found a page that told him to wait for instructions. Wait for instructions. That was all there was. Please wait for instructions. Nothing else. Maybe that's because he hadn't properly registered to the intranet. At least he found he could access where he needed to go. He went back to the introduction page and followed the instructions again to the page where he was expected to give his details. Here he felt apprehensive. It all looked legitimate, asking for full name, address, contact numbers, next of kin, taxation number, as well as links to statements of privacy, forms regarding health and safety, union advice, rights and responsibilities at work, ad nauseum. He never liked all this officious shit much. It all seemed so complicated and a bit unnecessary, even though it was in its own complicated way. In any case, it all appeared legitimate. For the life of him, he couldn't see why he couldn't trust this mob. And he'd worked for dodgy mobs before, delivering junk mail, bothering people on the phone about their stupid opinions about which political party they felt was the most trustworthy. Fuck it, he thought, and filled out his details. And in conclusion, he was presented to a page that welcomed him by name to the Monopile family, and he could start work whenever he wanted. He promptly went back to the data entry page, and was faced with the same blank statement. Please wait for instructions. Okay, he thought. Time to call maintenance. that at least should kill a few hours. Instead, he was confounded again by this company's promptness. He was almost instantly talking to a young-sounding chap called Gary. He told Gary his situation.
Yeah, that's okay, Mason. You're in. I'm just looking from my end and you're fine.
Does that mean I have to sit here and wait for instructions?
Yep, that's it, mate. Nothing simpler.
Well, how long does it usually take?
To get instructions, it'll vary depending on how much work's on. At your stage...
There was a pause in which Mason could hear keys being tapped.
Yeah, look, you're due to start actually working tomorrow anyway, so there won't be getting anything till then.
That made a sense of a kind. Ah, okay, sorry for being dense.
No worries, mate, no worries. You did the right thing logging in on now. Saves you a bit of time tomorrow, actually.
Okay, so when I come to work tomorrow, I'll start my training?
Yep, it'll all be there on the data entry page for you, and once you've finished everything, you'll be right to go.
Okay, so there won't be any more of this wait for instruction stuff then?
Oh yeah, no, that's perfectly normal, Mason. You'll be required to work as required. In the meantime, your time's your own.
What? That sounded ominous. But what am I expected to do in that time?
Ah, don't sweat it, mate. No one's under any hammer here. You're getting paid by the hour. You're sweet.
Okay, Mason replied, even though he didn't feel okay. So how long does it usually take to wait for instructions?
At your stage, you'll probably get something to do around the afternoon, just before you knock off.
That was the thunderbolt he had been expecting. Excuse me, I'm due to start work before I stop work.
Oh, mate, it'll take you 5 minutes at the most. You'll see it in the training. Even beginners can do it in 5 minutes. It's set up that way.
Mason was lost for words. He sat there with the phone trying to actually visualise this situation. He was expected to show up for work at 9 in the morning and then sit around all day waiting to do 5 minutes work before clocking off.
Mate, you okay?
The disembodied voice of Gary finally asked after the pause became more than a little embarrassing. Yeah, Mason lied. Look, thanks heaps, Gary. I appreciate you bearing with me.
No problems at all, mate. We all start somewhere.
The voice replied, sounding genuinely helpful.
Anything else I can help you with?
There was not. Mason had decided to go to the manager for some explanation. Beck had told him she was in the second office. It stood to reason the boss was in the first. He'd find out if he was actually in or not. Moving as if he was asserted in his determination, despite feeling anxious as hell, he strode down the hall towards that office. He found it, knocked on the door. A male voice asked him to come in. The manager's office was larger and more attractive than his own, as he expected. The middle-aged man at the desk looked as if he spent a lot of time sailing, swimming, skiing, and all those other things successful middle-aged middle-class men were expected to do with their spare time. He asked Mason if he could help him. Yes, my name's Mason Towell. I came here expecting to be interviewed for a job and was told by your assistant manager, Beck, that I actually had a job already. So I've been shown my office, I've logged in my details, and I've spoken to the maintenance bloke, Gary, and it seems I'm expected to do 5 minutes work in one 8-hour day. The manager smiled and nodded, then asked Mason to come in and sit down after shaking hands with him first and introducing himself as Rod. Firstly, welcome to Monopile. I would have caught up with you anyway, but I'm glad you've shown the initiative to introduce yourself. That's good. Mason cringed a little at this. As for your role here, you've pretty much got it already. Everyone on our level comes in and does their work when they're expected to. The jobs usually take, anything from 5 minutes to half an hour if we push to it, although you don't have to worry, we're pretty on top of things here. I'd expect at your level you'll be doing something like 25 to 50 minutes of input a week. Again, Mason could only stare. See, we've got a very unique system here at Monopile. We've managed to streamline everything down to the minutest detail. All our staff have to do in this department is give the occasional check-in and the whole thing keeps going. But you're going to ask what to do in the meantime? Mason nodded, and Rod just shrugged. Whatever you want. Surf the net, chat with your co-workers, they're a pretty friendly bunch, catch up with friends over the phone, work on that screenplay or novel, just as long as you respond when the system tells you there's some work to do and do it to the best of your ability. You're going to find it pretty easy to do once you've done the training. But Rod, seriously, I know it's not my business, but I don't understand. It's like I'm being paid to do virtually nothing but tick a few boxes every now and then. And Rod merely smiled and nodded. That's all that's required. You might find it a little boring at first, but you'll be surprised how quickly you get used to it. Talk to the others. We've got people who've been with us for 10 years. They love this place. There's no pressure. If you miss an announcement, and look, that happens, you'll get a reminder. It won't seriously put us back that badly. Right. The more it made sense, the less sense it made. A job where he could basically be at liberty to do nothing or anything he felt like, supply a token 5-minute amount of actual work, and that was it. He recalled, without really looking at the details, The conditions for superannuation, overtime pay, leave loading, salary packaging, annual leave breaks and so on. In some of the material he glanced back at the office, his office now. An office that was as bare as he imagined his existence to be. Sparse, barely functional, beyond those essentials, nothing. The work itself a reflection of that office space. The office a reflection of the corporate nothingness of this building he was in, set as it was in a corporate plot on the outskirts of an unobtuse suburban town, in this second-rate country, on this planet, in this solar system, in this galaxy, in this universe. That, at least, was how his mind would often work, and how it worked at that moment, as if he had been given a glimpse into an objective appraisal of not just his reality, but his position in that reality. A second later, he was merely staring at the smiling Rob. He collected himself, thanked his boss for his time, and went back to his office. It had full internet access, so he vaguely watched a few websites. He made a mental note to bring the book he was reading with him the next day. He looked out the window. Just the rest of the plot, other buildings much like this one, surrounded by bare plots of unutilised land, yards of dull suburban houses beyond, and the mirthless horizon. It was a clear day. He never liked clear days. This, it would seem, until when? How long would this job last? How long would it stay the same as it was at this time? How well or not would he get along with his co-workers? What exactly was he going to do here, and what was it that the company did in general? Everything was as vague as it was clear, as certain as it was uncertain. Everything was brought home to him, in this place and moment, as a final kind of understanding beyond which there was no more knowledge to expect. This was the proverbial it. For others, people with initiative or imagination or luck, there were lives of consequence and value, lives in which meaning could be ascertained. For him, this work in this office, in this building, in this area, in this town, in this country, on this planet, in this solar system, in this galaxy, in this universe. He had fitted in, the right person for this, the right job for him.